The nature of science. So you've learned the scientific method, and so this should just be a quick refresher, hopefully. So the scientific method is a set of steps that helps answer questions. So we have ask question, do research, make a hypothesis, experiment, analyze your data, report your results, or communicate your results. An important thing to note is that these steps are a guideline, and not all scientists do every single one of these steps in this exact same order, and sometimes they will have to repeat steps, and you can see that that's slightly built in here with this middle purple section, where after analyzing your data, whether your data supports your hypothesis or doesn't support your hypothesis, changes your route if you have to try this again. So let's take a closer look at each of these steps. So the first step is questions. Questions are driven by a person's curiosity. So we're going to follow an example of a farmer that is having an erosion problem. She wants to keep as much soil on her farm as possible. The farmer learns that there's a farming method called no-till farming, which allows farmers to plant seed without plowing the land. She wonders if planting seeds without plowing will reduce soil erosion and help keep more soil on her farmland. So in the big picture here, what is the farmer's questions? Well, the question is if planting seeds without plowing will reduce erosion and help keep more soil on her farmland. And so that's going to guide her research. And so research is learning as much about the topic to find out if further investigation is necessary. So you can look information up in books, magazines, the internet, and even having conversations with people is a form of research. So for our farming example, this farmer is going to learn about no-till farming to figure out if she's going to test her question. And she could look up information online about no-till farming. She could talk to farmers who practice no-till farming. Or she could read, I'm sure there's agriculture magazines out there that discuss this topic. So once she has done her research and decided to move ahead with this, she's probably going to, whether she thinks about it or not, is going to create a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is a reasonable explanation to a question. And in order for a hypothesis to be valid, it must be able to be tested. And it can be proven either right or wrong. So an example of a hypothesis that this particular farmer could create is, if I don't plow my fields, then I will lose less soil. She can test this, and it could be either correct or incorrect. So it is important to note when you write a hypothesis that it is in the if-then format. If I do something, then I will have some sort of results. Sometimes when you write a hypothesis in the if-then statements, it's called a prediction. So she is predicting that if she doesn't plow her fields, then she will lose less soil. So notice that this particular hypothesis has nothing to do with yield of her crop. It simply has to do with soil loss. So then she's going to perform her experiment. So when we set up experiments, experiments have different parts. So the first part is going to be called the independent variable. This is the thing that the scientist changes or manipulates throughout the experiment. So in our farming example, the farmer is going to choose two fields. One field will be plowed and the other will not. So the act of plowing is going to be your independent variable. Controls are parts of the experiment that are the same in both the fields. So we're going to grow the same type of crop, water it the same amount, fertilize it, make sure that one field doesn't have more hills than the other. It's facing in the same direction. Everything is the same between these two fields except if it's getting plowed. That brings us to our dependent variable. This is the end result of the experiment. So again, in our example here, how much soil is actually lost in each field? In order to get your dependent variable, you're going to have a starting point or some baseline data, because you need to know how much soil was there to begin with. So that brings you to your data analysis. The data is collected throughout the experiment, usually with some type of measurements. We use notebooks, computers, iPads to keep our data organized, which then allows us to put our data into tables and graphs. When scientists are collecting data, they're very careful to label all their numbers with units so that their numbers make more sense. Your data analysis can include written descriptions of what happened during the experiment. So in our farming example, maybe a bad windstorm came up. And so that would be important to note when it comes to soil loss, and also if there were any heavy rain events that could skew the data. So these would be types of written data that would need to be collected as well. So when you're collecting data from your experiment, there's possibility for errors. Some of them are unintentional, some of them could be intentional. So we could have your equipment malfunction. So like an electronic balance may measure 1 gram too high if it's not zeroed out correctly. There could be measurement errors, like stopping a stopwatch too soon or too late, and so you would have to redo that trial. So sometimes one data point is way off from the rest, and it may not be used in the data because it likely indicates that it was a mistake made. So once you've analyzed your data, you will need to make some conclusions about it. So studying the data, scientists need to answer these questions. What statement best explains this data? And then, did the experiment support the hypothesis? So back to our farming example, the farmer grows crops on the 2 fields for a season. She finds that 2.2 times as much soil was lost on the plowed field compared to the unplowed field. So right here, this indicates that she's analyzed her data. She's got some math to support her following claim that there was soil lost. She concludes that her hypothesis was supported. So that right there answers this question. Did the experiment support the hypothesis? The farmer also notes some other differences in the 2 fields. The plants in the no-till field were taller and the soil moisture seemed higher. She decides to repeat the experiment, but this time she will measure soil moisture, plant growth, and the total amount of water the plants consume. So with most scientific research, the scientists will notice some other observations which will lead them to further investigations. So after scientists complete an experiment, odds are they're going to write a paper to be published in a scientific journal. And so a scientific journal is some sort of magazine, whether it is online or an actually printed copy. And this magazine is for scientists interested in this particular field of science. So it is definitely catered to a certain reader. So in our farming example, the farmer, if she chose to write this paper and submit it to a scientific journal, she probably isn't going to submit it to a scientific journal about medical things or human body, because it's just not, you have to submit it to a journal within that particular field. So once that paper gets submitted to the journal, it's going to be peer reviewed. So a peer review means that a bunch of other farmers are going to read her paper, analyze her experimental techniques, look at her data, make sure her analysis of her data and conclusion aligns with her data to make sure her experiment was sound. If all of these other farmers and scientists come to the conclusion that yes, this experiment was done without bias, within the ethical realms, and that it has good, important information, then it would be published in the journal. Sometimes then this can lead to a theory being developed, which is a repeatedly tested hypothesis that has been supported many times. So after the peer review and the article gets published, a bunch of other farmers could see her experiment and her design, and they could start to mimic it in their own fields to see if they get the same result. If they get the same or similar results, it would support it many, many times, which could lead to some new scientific theory being written. The thing about theories is that they can be disproved if any conflicting data gets discovered. So, taking a step away from the scientific method, we're now going to look at some scientific models. Models help scientists explain and understand ideas. They take a really complex system and simplify it, and it will often only show a small part of a very complex system. Good models help scientists make predictions. Some models you can see and touch, so like the globe is an example of a model that you could see or touch. Other models are more like ideas and numbers, like a weather forecast. Weather forecasts are created based on a bunch of different mathematical models that are made by computers. So in order to test models, scientists might start a test run at a time in the past, and if the model accurately predicts the present, then it is probably a good model. So a physical model is a representation of something using an object. They can be three-dimensional or two-dimensional. So a globe would be an example of a three-dimensional model, and a map would then be a two-dimensional model. Usually these physical models are smaller and more simple than the real objects. They most likely leave out some parts, and good models will be often drawn or made to scale. So this photo or diagram shows you a model of the interior of the Earth and all the different layers. The crust, the moho, upper mantle, lower mantle, outer core, and inner core. And all of those things we'll talk about in a few chapters. Ideas or models are based on ideas that help scientists to explain something. It explains all the known facts. So an example here would be how Earth got its moon. And so one of these ideas as models says that Mars, a Mars-sized planet, hit Earth and rocky material broke off in both bodies. The material orbited Earth and then came together to form the moon. This represents something that happened billions of years ago. It accounts for the chemical makeups of the rocks on the moon and Earth and other meteorites around Earth. And they all have physical properties of the Earth and the moon. So this idea has taken facts such as the chemical makeup of the rocks on the Earth, Moon, and meteorites, and use that information to make some prediction of what happened in the past. Models that use numbers are going to be heavy with math and equations. So for example, equations help scientists to explain what happened in the early days of the universe. Since the universe formed so long ago, that math is the only way to describe it. Another example would be climate models. They include a lot of numbers, including temperature, ice density, snowfalls, and humidities, and all of these numbers are put into equations to make a model that predicts the future climate. And if you listen this winter, when we start getting snowy weather, you'll hear weather forecasters saying that the predicted snow ranges from 2 to 4 inches depending on which model they use. So these weather forecasters are looking at a bunch of different climate models, and each of these models have slightly different numbers that are input into them as far as temperature or snowfalls or precipitation. And that accounts for why there's a range of how much snow we're supposed to get. Lastly, we need to talk about safety. So there will be some safety symbols that you will see. Corrosive means that it will eat away at either your skin or other objects. Oxidizing means that it has the ability to catch on fire. Toxic, I think we know what toxic means. And high voltage means that there's a lot of electricity running through it. When you're in the safety lab, you need to make sure you're following directions. No horseplay. Use the correct amount of any materials. If you have long hair, make sure it's up in a ponytail. Closed-toed shoes and flats, just to prevent any accidents. No baggy clothing. PPE stands for personal protective equipment. So in the lady in this picture, she's got a bunch of PPE on. The gloves would be considered PPE, the safety glasses, and the mouth guard or shield breathing thing. You need to be conscious of sharp objects. Make sure you're not eating or drinking, and that also means no gum. Make sure your lab area is tidy. Make sure you clean up thoroughly. There's an eye wash station, fire blanket, and fire extinguisher in the lab. And as soon as something goes wrong, you need to tell an adult. You will be in more trouble if you try to hide it than if you just own up to what is going on. Some labs actually will happen outside. We call that in the field or going in the field. You need to make sure you have appropriate clothing. So if we go outside in the winter, you need to make sure you have a hat and gloves and jacket. Sufficient supplies, first aid supplies. Let others know where you are going. You should have access to emergency services and be familiar with the area, or go with someone who is. So most of this is if you're going in the woods or really in the field, not necessarily just out onto the football field like we'll probably be doing.